Welcome to Apple Teeny, where Apple prices, weird gadgets, and petty design fights all get airtime. If you thought the Apple TV was the boring, stable product in Apple's lineup, surprise. Storage is getting wild, RAM is getting weird, and somehow the funniest part is that old compression software is starting to sound reasonable again. Apple hiked Apple TV pricing hard, with some versions jumping from about $150 to $250. That's a huge move for a little black box that was already running aging A15 hardware. So the obvious red is component cost got ugly, and Apple also decided it was a great moment to fatten margins before a refresh. And honestly, when the sleepy living room accessory gets one of the nastiest percentage increases in the lineup, you know something upstream is broken. The big upstream problem is memory. AI server build-outs are inhaling RAM and SSDs, and the inflation there sounds less like normal supply pressure and more like a feeding frenzy, with reports way beyond the usual 20 to 30% bumps. One Micron executive basically said Apple helped create this mess by beating suppliers down so hard for so long that profits dried up, fab investment stalled, and now the whole system is less resilient. That is a brutal bit of industrial karma if it's true. Apple spent years being the shark, and now the ocean has teeth. Apple has reportedly even tried to get US clearance to buy memory from CXMT, a Chinese company on a military blacklist, which immediately turned this from a pricing story into a national security headache. They'd already backed away from using Chinese memory just for China because of espionage and supply chain concerns. So this is not exactly a clean, easy escape hatch. This is also where the AI boom stops being an abstract Wall Street story and starts smacking normal buyers. When data centers hoard components, the fallout shows up in Mac SSD upgrades, Apple TV pricing, education budgets, and every boring device category that suddenly isn't cheap anymore. A lot of this inflation is being described as irrational, and from a consumer angle. Yet, it absolutely feels irrational when storage upgrades start acting like luxury jewelry. Case in point, the Mac Mini now has an 8TB SSD option, and some builds climb to roughly $5,400 on a downspec M4 Pro configuration. In a bunch of those configs, the storage upgrade costs more than the computer you started with, which is just deranged behavior from the pricing menu. At that point, you stop debating processors and start staring at the SSD line item like it personally insulted you. Which is why the nostalgic callback to RAM doubler and disk doubler suddenly feels less like retro comedy and more like a software business plan. The chip roadmap is getting stranger too, with reports that Apple may effectively skip M6 and rush toward M7. The logic seems tied to on-device AI demands and memory pressure, with the base M7 reportedly aiming for about 240 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, way up from around 153 for M5. Pro and Max versions are supposedly farther out, Ultra later still, and Mac Studio might never even bother with an M5 stop along the way. That is a very Apple move, if true. Why take every stair when you can quietly remove one from the staircase? Then there's the leak that Apple could use Intel's 18A process for M7, plus advanced packaging like Foveros and EMIB. If that happens, it's a rare break from TSMC and a real sign Apple wants more supply chain options as geopolitics and capacity limits get tighter. And for Intel, landing Apple in high-end foundry work would be the kind of credibility boost money can't buy. It would also be one of the weirder plot twists in modern chip drama. Apple also gave Siri a new icon, and the reaction was basically, wow, that sure is a circle. The monochrome look is getting called bland and hard to distinguish, especially in menu bar contexts where clear visual identity actually matters. Where Siri itself still has reliability trust issues. The same Perl script question reportedly got a detailed, accurate answer at one point, and then later got a generic definition. That kind of answer roulette is deadly. If the assistant might be sharp or might be asleep, people stop asking. On the software culture side, WebKit reportedly has a hard rule against merging code that slows existing tests. You can admire the discipline there, but it also sounds very Apple in the least surprising way possible. Performance first, margins protected, feature catch-up maybe later. That trade-off helps explain why Safari can feel conservative while Chrome races ahead with standard support. And meanwhile, Mac users are still grumbling about recent UI shifts, especially the pill-shaped highlights and menu bar changes that some people think make macOS feel more like iOS cosplay than a desktop interface. Elsewhere in expensive hardware land, Valve announced a Steam machine starting around $1,050 and a loaded 2 TB version with controller lands near $1,228. Valve's stance is that it won't subsidize the hardware because that would clash with its open PC philosophy, which is principled, coherent, and probably not helping mass adoption. Apple, by contrast, only nudged Vision Pro from $3,500 to $3,700, which is modest by recent Apple standards. That suggests Apple wants to keep the line alive without torching early adopter goodwill, while bigger future pricing pressure may land on higher-end iPhones and rumored folding models instead. A couple quick delights from the margins, Sonos quietly supports a ridiculous number of third-party music services, including niche stuff like Nugs, which means some people just discovered their speakers were way more useful than they thought. Vintage computers remain gorgeous and mostly impractical, because nostalgia loses a lot of charm the moment old TLS, no Wi-Fi, and missing software show up. There was also a deeply specific notification bug where an Apple Watch wouldn't vibrate for a spouse's private iMessage, but would for the same person in group chats, which is exactly the kind of glitch that makes you question your relationship before you question focus mode. And the debate over what counts as a real Mac app remains unresolved, which feels correct. If you need a whole episode to define it and still can't quite pin it down, that's a very Mac app kind of problem. Also, the Even G2 smart glasses sound like productivity-first future guy eyewear, with monochrome overlays, teleprompting, AI features, and a ring controller. Very much not trying to be camera sunglasses for chaos goblins. That's it for Apple Teeny. If storage prices keep climbing, I'll be over here respecting 1990s compression utilities a little too much. Thanks for listening. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.